the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchan, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I'm great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. So we got some interesting, rare news out of the Capitol. Senator Marie Alvarado-Gil, who is a moderate Democrat, is switching parties. She's going to be a Republican, and she made the announcement on Steve Hilton's podcast show, who is a good friend of ours, as many PRI supporters know. So Senator Alvarado-Gil was elected in 2022. And she represents a rural, sounds like a rural district in northeast of the Central Valley. And she told Steve Hilton that, quote here, quote, in the past 2 years that I've been working in the Senate and I have not recognized the party that I belong to. And the AP story said that she said the Democratic Party's policies are hurting the middle class and children in California. So, Tim, what are you hearing there?
Well, the interesting thing about it is that she is kind of the accidental senator. She actually won in a fluke of the top two primary system. So when she ran for Senate in 2022, that was a district that has been held by Republicans for decades. And it was a perfect storm where there were like 5 or 6 Republicans running and 2 Democrats. And so the 5 Republicans split all the vote, and the 2 Democrats split the Democratic vote about evenly, and they made the top two and shut out the Republicans. So that was an embarrassing thing to begin with. And so Alvarado-Gil was the more moderate of the 2 Democrats running, and she was elected. So she was always going to have a tough reelection campaign. There was even rumblings that, Republicans might try to recall her to get the seat back into Republican hands. Her voting record has been the most moderate, certainly, of any Democrat legislator. Now, what she says about she's kind of a regular Democrat out in the real world, and she doesn't recognize the Democrats in the legislature. I think there are a lot of Democrats in California that feel that way, that don't see, every day or leading the evening news every night, just how kind of extreme the policies. They are pushing until you get into the caucus meetings and get in under the Capitol dome. Now, she says that the final straw for her was the retail theft legislation that we've written about on Right by the Bay and talked about on our podcast, and that when they put in those poison pill amendments to the legislation before the summer recess, that really pushed her over the edge. Well, I guess we have to take her at her word for that. It seems to me that she probably was looking at reelection in a couple of years and probably would not fare very well as a Democratic candidate in that district and in an off-year election, and thought that maybe her only way to get reelected would be to switch parties and join the Republicans. Now, what's been interesting to watch in the days since her announcement is that her announcement tour, as you mentioned, was really kind of interesting, right? She went on Steve Hilton, she went on with Elix Michelson in LA, but her press in the district, which, the Sacramento media market is kind of the prime media market in her district, she had a very rocky press rollout. She did an interview with Ashley Zavala, the Bulldog reporter from KCRA, which didn't go very well at all. Her handlers got involved a couple of times. She couldn't explain, kind of, was she supporting Kamala Harris? Was she supporting Donald Trump? She didn't really want to answer that question. There were a lot of questions that you would normally get when you switch parties that she either wasn't prepared to answer or didn't want to answer. So it will be interesting to see, will she solidify her political standing now that she's a Republican in the district, or will she continue to have kind of a rocky path forward? I don't know how much different her voting patterns will be now that she's become a Republican, but you certainly have to take her at her word on the main thing, that she just was uncomfortable being a member of today's Democratic caucus in Sacramento.
So, Tim, do you recall the last time that a Democrat turned Republican in the Capitol? I don't recall that at all. I don't remember.
It actually was 80 years ago was the last time that a lawmaker went from Democrat to Republican. Now, there have been those that have gone from Republican to Democrat, and I've uh, had a front row seat to some of those party switches. Most recently was when Assemblymember Brian Mainshine in the San Diego area switched from Republican to Democrat, but he was a more moderate Republican who obviously was uncomfortable with the direction the party was going during the Trump era. And his neck of the woods in kind of northern San Diego County certainly was trending blue. So, I think it was more authentic, with his party switch that, he probably was uncomfortable with the direction of the party. And certainly there was a, electoral aspect to it. And he's had two very close elections, one before his party shift and one after his party shift. So, um, the other one that was a key one in recent years was when the infamous Nathan Fletcher switched from Republican to, at the time, he switched to Independent, and then later went Democrat. We also saw, of course, Chad Mays, the former Republican leader of the Assembly, my former boss, switched from Republican to Independent, kind of the same reasons that Brian Mainshine talked about, being uncomfortable with the direction of the party in the Trump era. Those seem, again, you may agree or disagree with them or challenge their motivations, but it makes a little more sense with kind of who they were and kind of the path they charted before their party switches. But certainly becoming Republican, yeah, 80 years ago.
So for some less momentous news, but kind of amusing, Tim, I'm loving this Politico story I read this morning that Governor Newsom has quietly hired a famous photographer to the presidents and tech titans. He took photos of he was a photographer for Mark Zuckerberg, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. His name is Charles Omani, and he's been a former photojournalist and a war photographer, and he's now out and about taking photos of our governor. I'm looking at this political piece. Makes 200K a year. How about that, Tim? So fill us in.
I guess we should have gone to photography school to learn how to take good pictures, but it's kind of have mixed views on it. Certainly, governors of both parties have official photographers on staff to capture all the important moments because history is made in a governor's office and in a gubernatorial administration. So, it's important that, it's not just grip and grins that they're taking. They're taking the moments of history, the meetings, the events, etc. And even in the legislature, there are full-time photographers on both sides of the aisle to capture, kind of the history making there and all of the events. So the idea that he would have a photographer, well, that's in the normal course of business. But then the thought of, you're getting a $200,000 a year top-notch photographer who, this isn't just an excellent photographer. This is someone obviously who is capturing the Newsom legacy, who knows for what future purposes. So, it is not inappropriate to have a full-time photographer on staff, but it's certainly a terrible optic, and especially in these times, to have kind of a presidential level photographer taking pictures of Gavin Newsom. And it comes on the heels of, his basically made for television and still photography event the other day when he was out in the streets of LA cleaning up homeless encampments. And, you hear him talking and you hear him, saying that cities better do a better job spending the state homeless dollars, or we're going to take back some of that money. Well, A, you should look at your own record on spending homeless money, but B, it rings hollow when the whole thing is just you're posing for pictures and posing for the cameras. And so it will make you wonder going forward, is Newsom really just all about taking photos, or is he actually about leading and taking the state in a particular policy direction and actually making a difference on, the issues that are important?
Well, I got to believe that some eyebrows are raised among the regular staff that he is probably one of the highest paid government workers now, this photographer. So My hunch is that this is for his next presidential bid. You've got to have a beautiful book with memoirs and a biography, and these will be great photo ops. So if you're going to run for president, you've got to have a book and you've got to have photos.
And two, all those photos are public domain. So you could use those pictures for anything. Anybody could use those pictures. So yes, they certainly would be great fodder for him or anyone for the next campaign.
So let's move on to our podcast this week. It's a recording of a recent speech with Lord Roberts of Belgravia. And readers of his history books probably best know him as Andrew Roberts. His newest book is called Conflict, which he co-wrote with General Petraeus. So it was a great evening here in Los Angeles, a small dinner of about 50 or so. So we thought we would turn it into a podcast so that even larger audiences could hear his wonderful talk. He talks about the Tory party's rout in the UK and the Labour Party's victory, also some of the election trends he's seeing in Europe, and of course his book Conflict. So thanks for listening, and here's Andrew Roberts.
Join PRI on Saturday, September 21st at the Four Seasons Hotel Silicon Valley in East Palo Alto for our annual Sir Anthony Fisher Dinner, featuring this year's keynote speaker and Toby Family Freedom Prize recipient, Kimberly Strassel. You read her Potomac Watch column every week in the Wall Street Journal. You see her on TV in her regular appearances on Fox News Channel. And you read her best-selling books like The Biden Malaise. Now, come see her in person at a terrific evening supporting PRI. She'll discuss the 2024 election, what's going on in our nation's capital today, and the fundamental importance of civil liberties. Visit pacificresearch.org/events today to buy your tickets. While you're there, you can learn about sponsorship opportunities. We hope to see you on Saturday, September 21st. Tickets are selling fast, so visit pacificresearch.org/events today to secure your spot.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you this evening, and thank you very much indeed, Sally, for those tremendously kind words, and for mentioning my peerage. I was appointed by Boris Johnson and confirmed by Queen Elizabeth II, and then reappointed after Boris's fall by Liz Truss, and reconfirmed by King Charles III. And I like to say that not since the Wars of the Roses has it taken 4 heads of state and heads of government to appoint a peer. I was originally asked it was very sweet of Sally to say that she asked me to come here. We all know that when Sally tells you to do something, you do it. So I immediately, needless to say, said yes. But she actually asked me before the general election to speak about British politics. Considering that my party, the Conservative Party, has just suffered its most catastrophic defeat since the creation of the Conservative Party in 1834, I'm wondering whether or not there isn't some kind of exquisite sadism in the invitation, it slightly reminds me of my mother's invocation to me, my late mother's invocation to me, not to intrude on private grief. Nonetheless, now that you've done this, I am going to give you a few statistics about how truly catastrophic it has been for us. We have a House of Commons of 650 members. It's been the same size since Oliver Cromwell, and Labour in the last election won 412 seats, up no fewer than 211. The Conservatives are now at 121. As I say, the smallest number since the creation of the Conservative Party. Actually, there was a sort of Tory party that existed before that, of course, in the Georgian era, that they also had more than 121. So you could say that this is the worst result we've had for about 300 years. We lost 250 seats in the last general election. The Liberal Democrats are at 72, which is up 64, which unfortunately makes them a serious and substantial part of the British Constitution again, which we'd always hoped would never happen. The Scottish Nationalist Party lost 39 seats. They're down to 9. And this is one of the very, very few positive results, because it means that the union is saved, at least for the next 5 years, that we don't have to worry about demands for another referendum on Scottish independence and all of that. Another positive result, if, like me, you sit on the Conservative benches, in the Conservative interest, you're desperate for any kind of positive result at all, is that it has protected the first past the post system, which is so important to have strong government in Britain. One can look across any number of countries in the world which have automatically weak governments because of proportional representation. This has crushed the movement, especially, of course, within the Labour Party, for proportional representation. We have 5 Reform MPs, the party led by Nigel Farage. It was a very impressive result for them. They got something like 12% of the vote. And this is a very worrying moment for the Conservatives because, of course, although 5 isn't very much, nonetheless, if they stay in existence and they take the votes from a lot of natural Conservatives, then it could mean that we are out of power for a generation. And we also, much more worryingly, have 5 Islamist extremists in Parliament now, MPs who would never have got in under any other circumstances apart from the war in Gaza. They took the seats of several leading Labour members. The Islamist vote affects about 40 Labour seats, which in a very essentially the last election, the Labour vote, as I'll explain statistically in a moment, was very wide, but it wasn't at all deep. It was incredibly shallow, in fact. And so for there to have been no fewer than 5 Islamists is a worry, not least also because of the effect that it has on Labour policy. Keir Starmer has been sound so far on Israel. However, his wife is Jewish. He, of course, followed from Jeremy Corbyn, who was quite frankly anti-Semitic, and he recognised that this was part of the rebranding, the detoxifying, essentially, of the Labour brand, which has been so successful. However, on the big issues that we're facing at the moment, to do with the recognition of Palestine as a state, which many members of the Labour Party want, on an arms embargo against Israel, which also a lot of Labour Party members want, and the, in my view, disgraceful acceptance of the International Criminal Court's remarks on Israel recently, which essentially will mean that it will be impossible for Bibi Netanyahu to come to visit the UK, and that has been accepted by the British government. We see a movement away from the essentially pro-Israel stance that the British government had taken. So this is something that has to be watched carefully. It's something that is quite difficult to understand cephalogically in Britain even, let alone from across the Atlantic. But it does mean that Keir Starmer is going to, the new Labour leader and Prime Minister, is going to be under tremendous pressure from his pro-Palestinian left in the Labour Party. So a few statistics. I'm sorry, I know they're boring. However, what they do tell us is that the turnout in this election was only 60%. That's much lower than the 2019 election of 67%, but far, far lower than back in 50, for example, you had 84% of people voting. These are societal changes which are concerning. The Labour Party won 9.7 million votes. That's actually down from the 10.2 million that Jeremy Corbyn got in 2019. And the Conservative vote now is at 23.7%. Fewer than 1 in 4 voters vote Conservative, and that's down from 43.6%, which is what Boris got in 2019. So the two key factors really are the collapse of the SNP vote, as I mentioned earlier, but also the total collapse of the Conservative vote. Some went to the Liberal Party, quite a few in the north went to the Labour Party, but the huge amounts really either went to Reform or people just didn't turn out to vote at all, so we dropped that huge number from 14 million to only 6.8 million voters in the last election. Now, as everybody knows from when they wrote essays on the reasons for the outbreak of the World War I, you have long-term, medium-term, and short-term reasons for each of these electoral catastrophe. The long-term ones are pretty straightforward. We didn't have Brexit as a battleground any longer. The 3.5 years or so of the establishment's struggle to stop the British people's voice being heard in the 2016 referendum on Brexit was no longer a issue in the general election. So the way in which the whole of the British establishment, the House of Lords, the Times newspaper, the leadership of all three political parties, the Church of England, you name it, the Federation of British Industry, the whole of the establishment of Britain tried to stop Brexit from taking place even after, for 3.5 years indeed, after the British people voted for it. A majority of them voted for it in that referendum. And so one of the reasons why we did so well in 2019 was that Boris would not stand up for that, and neither would the British people. So that issue had gone.
We'll get back to next round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
The other was, as I mentioned, Jeremy Corbyn was no longer the Labour leader. He was, as well as being an anti-Semite, he's a Marxist-Leninist, an openly avowed one. To give him his due, he never denied his belief in Marxism, even during the general election. And it was one of the reasons, of course, why he lost so badly. However, it was something that was no longer part of the process that we had to fight over in 2024. We've lost the youth vote completely. Only about 6% of people aged 18 to 24 vote Conservative. 6%. It is a serious worry for us in the future for obvious reasons. We have done virtually nothing for youth. The thing that they want more than anything else is the right to buy houses at reasonable prices. And we have completely failed them in that regard, not only with regard to the actual number of houses that we build, which has been pathetic, but also with the level of interest on their mortgages that they would have to take out to buy. I know you here in Los Angeles have incredibly high property values and real estate costs and so on. But in Britain, it is something that makes people not vote Conservative. And this has been hitting us very badly for quite a long time. And the last reason, of course, long-term reason, is essentially we've been in power for 14 years. And it's in France, l'ennui is boredom is an essential sort of part of the political process. And if you are in power for 14 years, you have to be able to say to the electorate that you are representing change, very difficult to do after 14 years, and that you've got something new to say. Again, very difficult to do. And so, especially if actually you're some of the things that you can boast about are perfectly good and impressive, but overall, in fact, we failed to seem like a party which could deliver. There was a serious problem about the concept of competence and ability to deliver. And frankly, after 14 years, the British people weren't just bored of us, they were sick of us. And so we were thrown out. In the medium term, that's the long term. The medium term, we had COVID to deal with, of course, in which for over 18 months, the British taxpayer, paid the what was called the furlough scheme. We paid 80% of the wages of 80% of the British electorate. This was an extraordinary cost, needless to say, on the taxpayer, and forced taxes up. There were some positive aspects, undoubtedly. We were the first to stand by Ukraine in the after the invasion by the totalitarian dictatorship against a peaceful democratic neighbour. We actually were the first to give lethal weaponry and various stages of the lethal weaponry during that. And Boris, I think, has got a lot to be congratulated for that. But he also went to these parties in Number 10 after having told the rest of the British people that they weren't to have parties. And ultimately that was a devastating effect. That had a devastating effect on the British polity, not least this the advantage that it gave to the left-wing concept that the Tories have one rule for themselves and another rule for everyone else. And then when he did fall, he was replaced by Liz Truss, who, although her free market economics were absolutely sound in my view, the attitude she took towards taxation, towards the Laffer curve, towards Hayek and Friedman and so on were absolutely right. Her timing was absolutely disastrous. The idea that you could do all of this in the basis of one mini budget was something that the markets revolted against immediately, brought her down. She only lasted 46 days in office. Having said that, the penultimate day she did use to give me my peerage. So it wasn't all not all wasted opportunity as far as I'm concerned. But tragically, this very talented and highly intelligent free marketeer was just because she was essentially running out of time, was forced to do a series of reforms that the world markets simply weren't going to accept, and a lot of those tax cuts that she offered, in a very un-Thatcherite way, frankly, were unfunded. It's something that Margaret Thatcher, who I knew well and admired, and I see myself as a Thatcherite conservative, and she appointed me to take her place in the Margaret Thatcher Archive Trust, and she came to dinner at our house, and we went to dinner at hers. I still worship Margaret Thatcher, and but I know that she would not have tried to have done what Liz Truss attempted to do. And so we wound up with Rishi only having a maximum of 18 months in which to try to turn round a long period of being some 15 to 20 points behind in the polls, and that just simply wasn't going to be enough. And what he did was to, and this has been expressed by Kemi Badenoch, who's at the moment the favourite to become the next Tory leader, is that he talked right and governed left. And that turned out to be a disaster. He, on several areas, he just simply wasn't able to stick to the principles that we felt were likely to appeal to the British people, and those were amongst many of these, and we're now into the real sort of gut of the middle medium term reasons why we lost the election. He wanted to support rent holders over people who were giving leases, lords. He wanted to hit the landlords, even though landlords are much more likely to skew Tory than Labour. He wanted to regulate the football industry, which has been around for over 100 years, without being regulated. It's got perfectly reasonable self-regulation. He wanted to bring in regulation there, which is a big industry in any way. It's not up to Tories to bring in regulation of industries that can regulate themselves. He brought in laws against smoking, which meant that some people in 20 years or so time, a 39-year-old will be able to smoke, but a 38-year-old won't be able to smoke. It's next to impossible to enforce, it strikes me. And anyway, the nanny state is not something that the Conservatives need to help, regardless of health outcomes, it strikes me. The culture, we had enormous problems with the way in which, after 14 years, we still had, classic example, of course, being the trans issue, a complete refusal, essentially, of the government to do anything about the mutilation of young women who misguidedly wanted their bodies to be mutilated, and the government did not stop doctors from doing this. I mean, any doctor who cuts the breasts of a perfectly healthy young woman should be arrested for grievous bodily harm. And yet, instead of doing that, we allowed that to happen under a supposedly conservative government. And needless to say, after each of these emotional promises that we made, the ones that we weren't able to back up were tragic for us at the polls. The two most important ones being taxation, which we put up to the highest point that they've been since the end of the Second World War. We've had 70 years, really, and it was, and we are now being taxed in the same kind of levels as Attlee's Britain, as a result of having fought for 6 years in the Second World War. And this is just something that nobody expects or wants from a Conservative government. Now, of course, we did, as I mentioned earlier, have to pay 80% of the British people's salaries for nigh on 2 years. That was always going to be incredibly expensive. But we didn't essentially apologise to the British people for having done this, for having put their taxes up in the way that we did. We were quite sneaky in the way that we put some taxes up. Nothing like so sneaky as Labour are going to be, I hasten to add, in the future. But nonetheless, when people vote Tory, they expect taxes to stay the same or go down, not to go up. And the other thing they expect is for immigration, especially illegal immigration, to go down. And it did not. It went up, and it went up very significantly. In the last calendar year, we had some 60,000. I know to Americans that doesn't sound a huge amount of people, but we're a much smaller country than you remember. They're only 65 odd 70 million of us compared to your 300 plus million. So please see it in these terms. But nonetheless, we had these illegal immigrants crossing in small boats across the Channel. Not when the Channel is impossible in the sort of October and the fall, but nonetheless during the summer months, they came in, day out, and would, not all of them, of course, be intercepted, but those are the ones that we know were intercepted. And it was something that the British government simply was incapable, it seems, to have done anything about. And it was made much worse by the fact that when we did attempt to deport the people who we had collected and put in very expensive hotels, by the way, to the point that it was costing us some £8 million per day, which is what, $10 million plus. It just became something that infuriated the British people. Now, Keir Starmer has his own phrases about how he's going to deal with this, or hopefully deal with this. Frankly, none of them seem to add up as far as I'm concerned, but we'll see. We'll see. Maybe he will. But what was clear was that the Conservatives were unable to deal with this. And when they did have a plan to basically deport these people to a third country, Rwanda, in a plan that I very much supported, because I hoped not that it would necessarily lessen the numbers of people who were already here, because it would have been difficult to have sent out that many people to Rwanda. But what it would have done would to send a clear message to the people in France who are going to cross over in these small and very rickety and very dangerous boats. Many people actually drowned on the way over to the United Kingdom. It would send a message to them that there was no point in them coming, because if they did come, we would send them to Rwanda. But the European Court of Human Rights stopped us again and again and again. And every time we changed the law on this, and I know this because I traipsed through the division lobby in the House of Lords many times, and sometimes we would stay up till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning to get these laws passed, and immediately afterwards the lawyers would, in the European Court of Human Rights, would throw out what was British government policy in a party that was voted on under our democratic system, and in which we had won a big majority in 2019 with that in our manifesto. So foreign judges were able to stymie the will of the British people as expressed in the manifesto and in the ballot box. And it happened again and again, ladies and gentlemen. And when some of our leadership contenders for the Tory party leaders say that they wish Britain to leave the ECHR, please do not fall for the narrative of the left which says that these people are monsters and don't care about human rights and so on. They are not. They're people who are actually speaking for the British people.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
And then there's the short term. I mentioned competence, the sense that the British, that the Tory party was no longer competent in actually handing over, getting anything done. They would make promises, but they wouldn't actually be able to deliver on them. And this, in a sense, I think, was probably the most dangerous of all of the things. This was probably worse than taxes. This was probably worse than immigration. The idea that you can have ministers who stand at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, make a statement, make a promise, and then nothing happen afterwards as a result, was more undermining of the Conservative Party and politics in general, by the way. You know, the whole idea of what democratic politics is able to achieve than anything else. We had a lot of people who behaved extremely badly. There's a sort of general assumption in British politics that when it comes to wrongdoing, with Labour it's money, and with the Tories it's sex. And there was a ridiculously large number of Conservatives, and a few Labour, I hasten to add, but mainly Conservatives, who thought it was perfectly reasonable, and I know we're in a family audience here, to take photographs, intimate photographs of themselves, and send them over WhatsApp to all and sundry, essentially. And that too, you can imagine, ladies and gentlemen, slightly undermines the belief and the trust in the sense of politicians, especially, I'm afraid, in this case, Conservative politicians. Then the immediate short term, of course, was the actual election campaign itself. We had the Prime Minister announce the campaign during a rainstorm, where nobody thought to either give him an umbrella or to have somebody else come out with an umbrella to put it over his head. It was utterly cringe-making. He could have done it inside. And also the other advantage of doing this inside would have been that the person in the audience who played very loudly the song "Things Can Only Get Better," which is Tony Blair's campaign song, actually drowned out the Prime Minister as he was announcing the election. We thought that was pretty bad. But the very next day, Rishi, who I, by the way, like very much personally, I'm very impressed by his intellect. He's a very decent man. He's an upstanding and impressive figure who didn't have enough time to turn things round. By the way, didn't make that much easier by getting rid of 5 months by calling a very early general election. So he actually worked against his own interests, I think, in those terms. But nonetheless, he's a decent and upstanding figure. But then he decided to launch his campaign at the at the same shipyard as made the Titanic. It doesn't stop there, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't stop there. He then went to after the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, where he was photographed in front of things pointing out the Titanic. He then visited the D-Day commemorations, the 70th, 80th commemorations of D-Day, and left early. When your president and the president of France and Germany and so on were all there at an important commemoration. Yes, he had done the British commemoration bit, and he'd shaken lots of hands with veterans. It's very important to point out he didn't just sort of go there and come back immediately. He did a lot of the I'd say maybe 80+% of the things he was supposed to do. However, the one thing that was going to get massive international attention was the heads of state meeting. And he went back to London to preside over a manifesto writing meeting. And this, actually, I tell you what it did. It just created a sense of pity. By the time where there was a good deal of outrage, and indeed manufactured and entirely sort of confected outrage by a lot of the people in the Labour and Liberal Democrat parties. But when I knocked on doors in the various constituencies that I visited, and when I phoned people at Conservative Central Office and asked them how they were going to vote and took part in the telephone canvassing and so on, what I actually got was pity, and that is not a good thing in a general election. You so don't. You'd rather have pretty much anything, rage even, than the pity that came through. I think historians will be kinder to Rishi, I certainly will be, than a lot of journalists at the moment. He, as I say, he only had less than 2 years, and by that stage we had been 20 points behind in the opinion polls for the previous 2.5 years. And actually, when the general election took place, we were, as I mentioned, exactly 10 points behind. So the opinion polls didn't do us any favours. They got it pretty wrong, really. The difference between 20 points and 10 is big. But nonetheless, it was a total trouncing because of the way in which the votes got tighter, the turnout was smaller, our vote collapsed and went to lots of other places, especially, of course, Reform. What it meant was that there are now a huge number, well over 150, of Labour seats that have very, very small majorities. And also because of the turnout being so low and Tories deciding just not to turn up to the polls, they have a huge majority, 2/3 of the seats in the House of Commons, even though only 1/5 of the electorate voted for them. And so this is not impossible to turn round. Starmer himself, although he's getting a very good honeymoon, we do like to give our prime ministers a long honeymoon, unless, of course, they're Tories. And he's going to get a year or so as in his hand. But he is, as I've said in newspaper articles, and become quite unpopular for saying it, because you're always supposed to be very nice to any prime minister that comes in. But I have written that he's a vacillating bloviator. And he is. The manifesto that they have put out essentially makes it pretty clear that they would like to be the most left-wing government that Labour government, and therefore government, that we have ever had. They want to renationalise. They want to try to ensure through things like giving 16-year-olds the vote, and in fact giving foreigners, giving Europeans who live in Britain the vote, even though they're not British citizens. A sort of supermajority that will last for very many years. In order to do anything about this, we are going to have to win back the young. We can't carry on with 6% of the vote, needless to say. We're going to have to look at all of our policies and ditch those that are not popular with the British people. We know that nobody's going to listen to us for a year anyhow. We need a new leader and a good one, hopefully a charismatic one. And we are going to only fight on those issues where we know that the British people are behind us. And however hard we fight, we're going to lose because we're 200 seats plus adrift in the Commons. And even though the Conservatives and the Lords do whatever they can, ultimately, of course, the House of Commons has primacy over us. And we're also going to lose some 92 hereditary peers of the House of Lords, 47 of whom are Conservatives, and so that's also going to hit our vote very badly there. So all in all, it's always a good idea, especially when, funny enough, when speaking to Americans, because you are a naturally optimistic people, and so it's always a very good idea in one's peroration to try and look at the most positive aspects of whatever it is that you've been speaking about. But unfortunately, all I can say is that for any Tory today, all that they can possibly look at is what we call Starmageddon. Thank you very much.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.